You. And let's say the bracha for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiyitanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu v'tok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has commanded us to engage in the study of Torah. So we are starting a whole new book, the second book of the Torah today, Shmot, which means names, as you will see in the first verse. And so much happens in here, but of course, it's mainly the story of our slavery and being freed, the Exodus, and all the story of Moses and Aaron and Miriam and crossing the Red Sea. And it's just full of drama, and it's absolutely pivotal in the history of our people. So I'm going to take you through a couple of the chapters and point out some really interesting things about this Parsha, particularly in the language. Let's start on it's Shmot, Exodus chapter 1, page 317 in the Eitz Chaim, if you have it, or any Chumash. And could someone please read the first 13 verses of chapter 1? Get us going. You're allowed to read.
Funny.
I could read.
Thank you, Richie.
These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each coming with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The total number of persons who were of Jacob's issue came to 70, Joseph being already in Egypt. Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly, so that the land was filled with them. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground." So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pithom, and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites the various labors that they made them perform. Ruthlessly, they made life bitter for them with harsh labor at mortar and bricks and with all sorts of tasks in the field.
Thank you. You'll recognize these verses, many of them from the Haggadah for Pesach, telling the part of the Magi telling the Passover story. So what is really being emphasized in this initial passage is the extreme fertility of the Hebrews. Extreme for so many words about how they multiplied and filled the land, and what the king's reaction to that was. So I want to look at this language. If you go to verse 7, Vayamat Yosef, Joseph died. Uvnei Yisrael, listen to the verbs: Paru, Vayishratzu, Vayirbu, Vayamsu, B'ma'od ma'od, Vatimale ha'aretz otam. 4 verbs piled up in a row that all speak to their fertility. And it's quite dramatic because the narrative is emphasizing how very fertile they were. And you see ma'od ma'od, like a double, more and more. They are increasing. And the Pharaoh is very upset about this because he's afraid that they're going to join with his enemies and overthrow his power. And so he sets the taskmasters, he enslaves them, but ironically, or so I would say perversely, in verse 12, the more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out. So the Egyptians came to dread them. Now, something really interesting is happening here. The verbs of increase are taking us back. There should be, you're probably hearing an echo going all the way back to creation. And if you go to Genesis chapter 1, I'm just going to show you this. You're going to see the same verbs were used in the original creation story that are being used here for the Israelites. So look on page 8, Genesis chapter 1, verse 20. And God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, sherets, nefesh chayam, and birds that fly above the earth. He created the great sea monsters, which the living creatures of every kind that creep, which the waters brought forth in swarms. There's that word again. And God saw that this was good. And then God gives the first commandment: be fertile and increase, peru or avu, umilu et hamayim, and fill up the waters. So God is starting with the animals, and then of course he goes to man, to human beings, and he gives them the first mitzvah, which is again peru or avu for human beings. So this that's in verse 28 of Genesis chapter 1. Be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it. Okay, so these verbs that are in creation are showing up again in the story of Bnei Israel in Egypt. We're back to Exodus now, page 318, chapter 1, verse 5, and following. And what is, how this is interpreted by the rabbis is a people is being born. A people is being created, our people. And yet, if you look at those verbs, I'm going to read them in English. The Israelites were fertile and prolific, verse 7. They multiplied and increased very greatly. So the land was filled with them. But it's not a totally accurate translation, because Vayishritzu literally means swarmed. And I don't know about you, but I find this language kind of troubling because it's the language of dehumanization. It becomes Hitler's language. It has been used against any unwanted people that are viewed as vermin or subhuman. And yet it's being used for us, right?
By us.
Yeah, by us. Exactly. And so, we have to look at why that language is there, why the emphasis on their extreme fertility. And I think it's like two perspectives. It's our story, but it's also this Pharaoh, this ruler, who is so threatened by this extreme fertility that he turns around and dehumanizes these people. And I want you to look at this verb in verse 12. The more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. And the word in Hebrew is vayakutsu. Vayakutsu literally means loathed, an extreme kind of hatred. And it's only used 2 other times in the Torah. One is in the book of Numbers, one in Leviticus. I'm not going to go chasing those references, but if you want them, I can give them to you later. But it's used for a special kind of dislike that is really intense. Okay, So you've got this Pharaoh who, absolutely hates the Israelites and is going to impose labor on them. And if you look in the verse 13 and 14, you'll see the word avodah, vayavdu Mitzrayim et bnei Israel b'farah, avodah kasha, avodah basadeh, kol avodatam asher avdu bahem b'farach. You hear 5 times the word oppressed them or made them labor. Okay, so you see the punishment that they get for simply being prolific. Okay, so we've got a situation where the ruler, the all-powerful, or he sees himself as all-powerful, is feeling very, very threatened. Now, let's go to, hold on, find my outline here. Nechama Leibovitz, I just want to, she gives a very good summary of this situation, of the verbs, the 4 verbs. She said, they are almost synonymous verbs of increase that seem to gain momentum until climax by the double-barreled intensifier of ma'od, more and more. And Rashi tried to, not Rashi, Rashbam, his grandson, tried to differentiate between these 4 verbs. But Nechama Leibovitz says, nah, it's not that, the subtleties are not important. What's important is the stylistic device emphasizing the extraordinary nature of this population explosion. So what we have here is a whole people that is feeling very bitter. And as Nechama Leibovitz says, let me get to I'll get to her other comment in a minute. Okay, so now we get to the midwives, right? And the midwives are performing maybe the first act of civil disobedience because, Jay, is it urgent?
The thing that's not said is why the Pharaoh and his people didn't like the Jews. He could have said they would support us, but then for some reason or other, which is not told, he said they will be against us.
Perhaps because they're different. They have different customs. You're right. It doesn't spell out the reason totally. We can look at commentaries about that. It's a very good question. So hold on to that. Will you ask me that again at the end, please? Okay. I want to make sure I remember it. Okay. So now we've got the midwives, and the king of Egypt is going to go through or impose a campaign of population control by telling them to kill the male babies, and the midwives refuse. And it's very interesting because they are named here, which is highly unusual. Stick in the back of your mind the idea of names, because names throughout this Parsha are really interesting, and we're going to get back to that. And the midwives tell Pharaoh, when he says, why did you let the boys live? They make up this thing. Oh, the Israelite women are vigorous, and before the midwife can get there, they've given birth. But look at the word that's used for vigorous, chayot. This is in verse 19, page 321. The midwives tell Paro, because they kind of know, they figured out what his mindset is, that he's dehumanized these people. And they say, these women are like animals. They just, like rabbits or whatever. They're just going to give birth, and we can't get there in time. Okay, so then Paro imposes an even worse decree that every male child shall be thrown into the Nile. And that will be his method of exterminating the people, or at least the future of the people. All right, now, Nehemiah Leibovitz summarizes chapter 1 by saying, the picture drawn here of Israel is one of unrelieved gloom, characterless and faceless, devoid of personalities, I would say, except for the midwives, and bereft of leadership, a suffering, downtrodden mass with no heroic figures. All of that is going to change because we're going to jump into chapter 2. And chapter 2 reminds me of the opening of the old West Side Story movie. Do you remember how the camera gives you an aerial view of New York City, and then it zooms in, it comes down, and it zooms in until you get to one place with one group of people? And that's what the narrative is doing here. It's very artful, very intentional, I think, because we're going to the spotlight is going to go straight to Moses. So somebody please read chapter 2, verses 1 to 10, page 321.
I'll read it.
Thank you, Patty.
Certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket for him and caulked it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child into it and placed it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile, while her maidens walked along the Nile. She spied the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw that it was a child, a boy crying. She took pity on it and said, "This must be a Hebrew child." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter answered, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son. She named him Moses, explaining, "I drew him out of the water."
Thank you. So now we have our heroic figure to be, not yet, but the spotlight is definitely on him. And when I say light, there is a beautiful midrash that says that when Moshe was born, the whole house filled with light. For it is written, she saw the light that it was good. And there's another parallel with the story of creation. When God saw the light that God created, he saw that it was good, ki tov. So if you look at the Hebrew, in verse 2 of chapter 2, the woman conceived and bore a son. When she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. The Hebrew says, ki tov hu, that he was good. And in this sense, beautiful. So you've got another, it's a beautiful symbol, I think, of the light that Moshe is going to bring to the people, with this very clear linguistic or language connection with Breshit. Now, no one else in Moshe's family is named yet. They're all going to be named later, but his brother, his sister is just his sister. His mother and father have no names yet, which, is showing us that this baby, this one character, is going to be the central character. And, I think that's deliberate too. But he's not called Moshe yet. He's called Hayeled, the boy, the little boy, the child, emphasizing that he's, his existence is in jeopardy given Pharaoh's decree. And his survival is going to be essential. So it takes 2 women plus his mother, two women, Pharaoh's daughter and his sister Miriam, to rescue him, to ensure his survival, and then in partnership with Moshe's mother, who nurses him until he is weaned. And I want to look with you at the language here too, because there's a verb that's coming up that's going to be crucial for the whole rest of the Parsha, or at least the part that we're doing today. So the child is put in the basket, put in the Nile. Pharaoh's daughter comes down to bathe. She sees the child, and look in verse 6. Vatitach vaterehu. Sorry, I can't. Tirehu. She opened it and she saw. Ro'ev. You can see resh aleph hey. That verb which means to see. She sees that it's a child, a boy, and immediately she takes pity. And keep in mind this link between seeing and compassion, okay? Because that's going to come up again. She sees this child and she takes pity. She gets it right away. She understands this is the Hebrew child. And she rescues him, and Miriam steps in, offers the mother to nurse the child, and then brings him back when he's weaned. And it says Pharaoh's daughter named him Moses, from the Egyptian word to draw out. Now here's my question: what did Pharaoh's family? What did Moshe's family call him?
Exactly.
After he was born, what did they call this Yeled? It doesn't tell us, right?
Why didn't he have a name?
Right. Okay. So, of course,
How many days? You don't get a name for 8 days.
well, but he wasn't weaned in 8 days. It took longer than that. There was a period of time when he
3 months.
was living with them, and he wasn't weaned. And so,
yeah, I'm going to ask the question because I know Arnold Sager wants me to ask. Was he circumcised?
was he?
Not yet.
Not yet. No, I mean, it doesn't say. It doesn't say. Good question. I mean, maybe he was, and maybe that's how Pharaoh's daughter knew. That's a really interesting theory. Because she hid him, his mother hid him for 3 months, so he could very well have been circumcised. Probably was. Okay. Now, here are some commentaries on Moshe's name. Ibn Ezra, Spanish in the 11th century, said, Moshe, and you have this note also in Eitz Chaim, Moshe or Moses is a Hebrew form of an Egyptian name. It was Manios in Egyptian. And Ibn Ezra said, perhaps the daughter of Pharaoh learned our language, or she asked someone for its Hebrew version, knowing that he was a Jewish child. That seems, a little bit out there. But listen to Chizkuni, French commentator in the 13th century. She named him Moses. According to our sages, this proves that she converted by immersing herself in the Nile to Judaism and learned the Hebrew language. This is Pharaoh's daughter. An alternate explanation, the daughter of Pharaoh did not know any Hebrew, but the plain meaning of the text is that his mother Yocheved called him Moses. When the daughter of Pharaoh wanted to know the meaning of this name, Yocheved explained to her that in Hebrew, the word Moshe derived from hamishka, which means drawing something or pulling it. When hearing this, the daughter of Pharaoh agreed wholeheartedly with the name given to this infant, for in her own words, quote, I have pulled him out of the water. You see, he's got Moses' mother doing this whole language thing that we do now, that she's so interested in the name of this child that she does, she wants to make a connection between Egyptian and Hebrew. She added that in the future, she hoped that what she had done for that infant, he would do for others when he would grow up. That is, he would pull the Jewish people out of Egypt. So again, this is a commentary and interpretation, but guess what? The Midrash goes on, and it is said that the daughter of Paro left Egypt with Bnei Israel in the Exodus and was at Sinai. So there's a tremendous effort on the part of the commentators to make the daughter of Paro sympathetic to the Jewish people and formative in Moses's sense of who he was, of his identity. I think that's just so interesting. Okay, let me see where we're going next here. Okay, let's go to verse 11 in chapter 2. And the key, what I'm calling this section is the making of a leader. We're going to look for qualities that Moses is demonstrating that will help us understand why he becomes the leader. So can I have a reader for chapter 2, verses 11 to 17, please? Thank you, Judy.
Thank you, Gail. Good morning. Sometime after that, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his kinsfolk and witnessed their labors. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. He turned this way and that, and seeing no one about, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he found 2 Hebrews fighting, and he said to the offender, "Why do you strike your fellow?" He retorted, "Who made you chief and ruler over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses was frightened and thought, "Then the matter is known." When Pharaoh learned of the matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh. He arrived in the land of Midian, and he sat down beside a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. But shepherds came and drove them off. Moses rose to their defense, and he watered their flock.
Thank you. Okay, so here we have 3 episodes in close succession that are going to start showing us Moshe's leadership ability. The first thing to notice is that Moses knows he's Jewish by now. And we know that in verse 11, sometime after that, when Moshe had grown up, he went out to his kinsfolk and witnessed their labors. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. And the word in Hebrew is ach echav, ach. Ach in Hebrew means brother. Achot is sister. Miriam is his sister. But he sees his brother. He went out and he's curious to know what is their lot like. What are their lives like? So he goes out, which is a strong action verb. Vayetze. He goes out and he sees. Now, you could start counting all the verbs of seeing if you feel like it, but there are going to be a whole bunch of them now, and they are key to understanding Moses's leadership ability. So 2 times we have brothers or his kinsmen in verses 11 and 12. In verse 11, 2 times. Okay, so that's really underscoring the idea that he knows that these are his people. And what does he do? He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He turned this way and that. Take note. Vayifen ko v'ko. He turned this way and that. And seeing again, no one about, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, you can say, what was his motivation here? He turned this way and that, and seeing no one was about. Is he making sure that no one's watching. There are no witnesses to this deed, because if he were seen killing an Egyptian, that would be the end of him. He'd be killed for that. That would be, a crime. However, I came across a really interesting commentary that puts a different light on this. And this is from Rabbi Ariella Rosen of Jewish Theological Seminary, who talks about the bystander effect. The bystander effect, as studied in psychology, is about a situation where a human being sees another human being in trouble. And they've done, they've studied this. And what they found is that a solitary person passing by, a solitary bystander, is way more likely to jump into action to help that person who's suffering in some way or hurt than if a whole crowd is standing around. Now, I'm sure there are exceptions to this. Thinking of George Floyd, actually, right now, there was a crowd. But, this idea that a person who's alone and sees a fellow human being hurting, and there's no one else coming by, he feels a sense, or she feels a sense of responsibility to that fellow human being. Not always, but Rabbi Rosen is saying here, maybe that's what Moshe was thinking in this situation, that, okay, there's no one else to help this person, I'm going to jump in. So I think you can read it both ways at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. He's afraid of getting caught, but also he feels compelled to act. This is a leadership quality. I think we could agree on that. Okay, so then the next day he goes out again and he finds two Hebrews fighting, and he tries to intervene. And now he's in trouble because apparently it's been known, someone saw or heard that he killed this Egyptian. And so this one Hebrew says, "Who made you chief and ruler over us?" Oh my, there's an echo here of what's going to happen much later with Korach.
Yeah.
Yep. Moses's leadership is questioned numerous times. Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptians? So now Moshe is frightened, and he thought the matter is known, and indeed Paro learned about it, and Moshe has to flee. So a second leadership quality that was just demonstrated is that when you see two people fighting, you try to make peace. It was Aaron who later was known as the peacemaker, but I think here it was Moshe who wanted to stop this fighting between two of his own brothers, two members of his people, and so this also is something to keep in mind, I think, as a quality of a good leader. And now we're going to have the third situation when he flees to Midian. And he meets Zipporah. He rescues the daughters of Reuel, who is Jethro. That's another name for Yitro, who becomes Moshe's father-in-law, and he intervenes when the shepherds are attacking these young women and rose to their defense and watered their flock. So in this case, he's intervening to help people who aren't Jewish. They're just fellow human beings, and they need help. And so he's intervening with them. So again, what we're seeing here is many qualities of a leader. First, he sees, then he acts. And he sees, he feels compassion and responsibility, and then he acts. So, this is young Moshe. Some commentators think he's only 12 here. He's somewhere between 12 and 20, they say. but clearly he's got a moral conscience. Okay. Now, let's go to, we can come back to all of this. I think we'll have time. Let's go to chapter 2 in Exodus, verses 23 and 25. Moses is marrying Zipporah. It is said in the commentaries that he spent 60 years living in Midian with Jethro, his father-in-law, and Zipporah. Really long time. But we have a long time after that. So it's unspecified how long. The rabbis are going to try and figure out exactly how long. All right, I'm just going to read this. A long time after that, the king of Egypt died. I'm on the top of page 326. Exodus 2:23. The Israelites were groaning under their bondage and cried out, and their cry for help from the bondage rose up to God. God heard their moaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. Now, we can get into a whole discussion of why did it take God so long? And I'm not going to try and answer that, but from the point of view of the Israelites, God's been absent, and they are in desperate straits. And so finally, God hears, Vayishma, and he remembers, Vayizkor, the covenant, Vayar, and he sees. Here we've got another accumulation of verbs. He sees Bnei Israel, and he took notice of them. You see a parallel with Moshe here. Moshe, what he just did in this episode with the Hebrew being beaten by the Egyptian, he's seeing something and he's acting, and God is doing the same thing here. As far as the timing of it, there are commentaries on that, but let's just accept it for what it is for the time being. Well, actually, I'll give you one. The groaning. This is Rambam. Rambam says the groaning of Bnei Israel is because they the custom of all subjects of a wicked tyrant is to hope for and look forward to the day of his death. But when the Israelites saw that the king died, they wailed bitterly, lest a godless man may come to reign, who will be more wicked than the preceding king. So this is his interpretation of why they're groaning, with quite an understanding of what an oppressed people goes through. Let me see. There's another, Ibn Ezra says, a new king came to power who was even harsher than the previous king. So this is a new Pharaoh, by the way. If you thought the Pharaoh through Exodus is one person, no, there are two Pharaohs. The second one is thought to be Ramses II, and the first one is thought to be, I think his name was Sito, can't find it, but anyway, the Egyptians kept track of all their kings. They kept very meticulous records of it. Okay, so there's an idea that they're afraid that the next ruler is going to be even worse than the one that they've been suffering under. All right, and now we have chapter 3, the crucial turning point, really, for Moses and the future of the people. And this is the burning bush. So how about if we have somebody read the first 10 verses in chapter 3, page 326.
I'll read.
Thank you, Merle.
Now Moses, tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, drove the flock into the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. An angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire out of a bush. He gazed, and there was a bush all aflame, yet the bush was not consumed. Moses said, I must turn aside to look at this marvelous sight. Why doesn't the bush burn up? When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called out of the bush, Moses, Moses. He answered, Here I am. And he said, Do not come closer. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you stand is holy ground. I am, he said, the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord continued, I have marked well the plight of my people in Egypt. I have heeded their outcry because of their taskmasters. Yes, I am mindful of their sufferings. I have come down to rescue them from the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the region of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. Moreover, I have seen how the Egyptians oppress them. Come, therefore, I will send you to Pharaoh, and you shall free my people, the Israelites, from Egypt.
Thank you so much. So this is absolutely pivotal event in the story of our people and in a turning point for Moshe. So I want you to look with me at all the verbs of seeing in this whole episode. There are so many, and think a little bit about what kinds of seeing there are, what kinds of seeing are going on here, and how important it is to see. So Moses, the first one is in verse 2, Vayera malach Adonai. Vayera is appeared to him, so he could see it. An angel appeared to him in a fire out of a bush. And he gazed. Vayar, he looked, and there was a bush that was aflame but not consumed. Too bad the bushes in California were not like that.
Yeah.
Right? That's like so much fire on our minds these days. Moses said, I must turn aside, notice the turn aside, and see and look at this mar'eh hagadol hazeh, ve'ereh et hamar'eh hagadol hazeh. Two verbs of seeing. One is a noun made out of the verb. I must see this amazing sight. Why doesn't the bush burn up? Now, when God saw Vayar Adonai Kisar Lir'ot, that he turned aside to see, to look at, he called to Moses from the bush, and Moses says, Hineni, crucial word. And so we have already like I think I counted 5 verbs of seeing right there. And the whole thing is like turning on Moses noticing something unusual and actually doing something about it. Same way with the Hebrew slave. He sees it and he acts. There probably was no one else around. Maybe it's the solitary bystander. He's out in the wilderness, notice, tending the flock of his father-in-law. And this miracle is just for him. Clearly, if you're looking at it from the divine point of view, this is his call to action, his call to God. And Moses, when God speaks to him, hid his face, right? Like he's covering his eyes. It's too overwhelming to look at it. He knows he was afraid to look at God. So 2 more verbs of seeing. And God continued. Look at this one in verse 7. Vayomer Hashem, Ra'o Ra'iti. I have seen the oppression of my people in Israel. Ra'o Ra'iti. It's a form a doubling of a verb that you have many times in the Bible for emphasis. Not just I saw, ra'iti, but I really saw. I am really seeing it now, how they're suffering. And this is what I'm going to do. I'm coming down to rescue them and take them out, bring them to the land that I've promised your ancestors. And again, God says it in verse 9. I've heard their cry, v'gam ra'iti. I've seen their suffering and how the Egyptians have oppressed them. So now I'm going to send you to Paro, and you shall be the one to free them, to take them out from Egypt. Okay. The importance of seeing, I'm going back here to Rabbi Ariella Rosen for a minute, is there's a whole debate among the rabbis, she says, of how much Moshe turned aside to look at this miraculous phenomenon. One rabbi said, Yochanan said, Rabbi took 3 steps forward, but Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, all he did was turn his neck. He didn't step close to the bush. And in that interpretation, God said, because you took the trouble just to look, be assured you will merit that I shall reveal myself to you. So, I think there's different degrees of seeing. There's seeing something, then you have to register it. Then you have to really think about it and understand it. And all of that is contained in the word seeing. Like if someone says to you, you're not seeing my point of view, and you say, well, then please explain it, please clarify. And this person takes the trouble to explain it, and you say, now I see, I understand, I've grasped it. So all these levels. And just to continue that commentary, even the simple act of turning his neck a few degrees was enough for God to decide Moses was worthy of the mantle of leadership. And so Rabbi Rosen asked, what would it take for us to allow ourselves to turn aside, to truly notice that which is unnatural or unjust, regardless of whether or not others join us? It's a really good question to think about in our own lives. But what's going to happen next? We've got a whole bunch of verses, 28 verses. The next 28 verses are Moshe saying, what me? I can't do this. I don't merit it. I don't have the ability. And he goes back and forth with God to the point where God gets angry. It says God gets angry. And Moshe is just like, I can't do this. And he's the first one, because later on Jeremiah does the same thing and Jonah does the same thing. But Moshe really tries the hardest. Well, I don't know. You could say Jonah running away on a ship and falling asleep is a pretty difficult way to escape as well. So my question here, and now I'm going to open it up. We have another 10 minutes. Good. We can try and get out all the comments and questions. My question to you is, do you think that a person who lacks some confidence in himself can make a good leader? Or let me turn that around. Is a sense of humility and not being quite sure you're the right one for the task a quality that's desirable in a leader? Is there some aspect of it that is actually good, that he's not too sure of himself, right? So that's the question I want to start with here, and then we'll take some others. But I just think it's so interesting that Moshe really works so hard not to do this. I mean, yes, he proves a fantastic leader, the best we've ever had. Stephanie.
Good morning. I don't like arrogance in a leader. So I think that the fact that he was not an arrogant man maybe was a really good quality.
Thank you.
Stephanie, are you equating arrogance with confidence?
Am I? Or
No,
not?
I was asking Stephanie because I agree, like arrogance is such an ugly characteristic, but I don't think it's the same as being confident.
I would agree.
I would agree.
Oh,
You're
Stephanie,
muted.
unmute.
Sorry, I think you can be confident in your skill set or confident as a person and not completely. And that could potentially make you a good leader. But when you're arrogant in your, that to me makes you a very poor leader.
Merle.
Well, I agree with your point, Steph, on arrogance. I think it's good that Moshe evolves because he's up against tremendous challenges. So I think it's good that he does grow in understanding and confidence. But I was thinking someone also who's not arrogant, but is wise and compassionate can emphasize his duties in service, that he is serving a people, he is serving a mission, where undue arrogance and in a too much confidence kind of tweaks that they are serving him, and that is not a good quality in a leader.
Thank you. Ed.
God has chosen Moses. We see this in any number of situations where Moses is put into a situation where some action has to be taken. And the action that has been taken is a leadership characteristic that we associate with Moses. And I think what they're trying to show in these several incidents is the development or the maturity in Moses leading up to his leadership of the Exodus.
Yeah, I love the way you're using the word evolution, because, you know, a leader isn't born full grown, all ready to lead. The leader is going to learn, needs experience, right? Needs several other qualities which can develop as he matures, or she, right? Thank you. Other David.
So I think we have to distinguish leader from the task that Moses and even Jonah are called to. This is to serve God and do something. So, yeah, arrogance is bad. We know Pharaoh was arrogant, but I think this is different. And so, was Abraham Lincoln shy about becoming a leader? No, he wanted to be the leader. Did George Washington? So George Washington says, no, I really don't want to be the head, but he didn't put up too much of a fight. He was already a general. So I think we see some great leaders that want to be leaders. But here, Moses is saying, you're asking me to do something from this concept called God to go to Pharaoh. It's not being a leader. I don't, it's another word, and maybe you all can help me with it. But this is so different to being called by God as a prophet to do what they're doing. And I think there's a distinction.
Interesting point.
So think about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. I can't come up with other good presidents.
So he's being given a mission, right?
A mission, yes.
A mission that he has to carry out. But because the mission involves saving the people, I think that's where the leadership qualities come in. But definitely a mission, you know, God says, I will send you, not do you want to go? You know, how do you feel about this assignment? You're going.
I also want to add, it also seems to parallel the concept that the weak inherit. So it's not the powerful that get the job. It's not this person who puts his hand up. Here he goes to Moses, who didn't want this. So we see this in Genesis, you know, where it's like they didn't want to be there, but they had to be there because God said, you got to do this.
Mhm.
Moses had the most, he was the one that knew the most. I mean, having lived there and in the palace or whatever, he knew the most about the structure and how things worked, where the other people are outsiders. It's like if you take me and put me, somebody that may be living someplace can do a better job than somebody that's just from the outside. So
That's an interesting point.
Yeah, that's good on God then.
Yeah, Patty had her hand up.
So this is kind of back to when we weren't allowed to make any comments.
Sorry.
But back on page 323, we're talking about Moshe's name. And it says in an explanation, it says Moshe is active in form and wait, let me back up. Moshe is active in form and means one who draws out, a name that fits his future situation better than his present one.
That's good.
Right? So we were talking about him, you know, that got that name like he was drawn out of the water, but here it's talking about like his future, and that's exactly what we're talking about now.
Right. And in the midrash I gave you about Pharaoh's daughter and her reason for naming him that,
That's
the rabbis take that idea that you just put out and say she thought that he would be the one to draw his people out of trouble, you know, that he could literally take them out.
Yeah.
There was another hand.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Somebody else?
Just a little aside. I can't see if anyone else has a hand up before me, Gail. Does anyone else have a hand who hasn't spoken?
At the moment, no, I don't.
Oh.
Thank you.
When you were talking about qualities of the leader, and Moshe's reluctance at first, and then his development and evolution. Certainly, we know that bravery and courage doesn't mean one is not reluctant or afraid. It means ultimately one is willing to do the task. And I think Moshe certainly evolved to that point. It doesn't require a total lack of fear or an abundance of confidence, even just a willingness to do the task or accept the mission.
Yeah, I mean, some fear is realistic. This is a daunting task that he's being given. Some fear is realistic. It's, you know, a question of how you handle it. By the way, I read some commentaries, old ones, not modern, saying that because Moshe had been away, by the rabbis' calculations, 60 years, he forgot the Egyptian language. But I tend to agree with Bev's point that he was familiar of all the people. He lived in Pharaoh's court. He knew, well, of course, now he knew how it works. He knew about the magicians, he knew about the hierarchy of power. He knew that the king thought he was divine, and so on and so on. David.
So it occurs to me, so the Israelites had grown very populous, and that's one of the problems here. Where were their leaders? They don't talk about any current leaders of the group of Israelites that Moses comes back into. He doesn't have to talk to any tribes or anything else, just gather up everybody else. And his brother Aaron comes, and they're able to see Pharaoh, who's the big guy. So can you imagine if somebody said, hey, I want you to go talk to Trump tomorrow? And Trump says, okay, sure, come on in. So it's a pretty amazing sequence of connections here.
So there are commentaries that say that Moshe's father was like an elder in the Jewish people at that time. And that there's a midrash, you may or may not have heard this, that when Pharaoh decreed that all the boys should be killed, the baby boys, Moshe's father divorced his mother, so that they wouldn't create any more children. And Miriam went to her father and said, hey, Dad, you can't do this. You know, that's going to spell doom for the whole people. You can't do that. Oh, and I left something important out. So after Amram, Moshe's father, divorced Yocheved, his mother, everyone else did the same. That's important, an important point in this midrash. And then when Miriam persuaded her father to remarry her mother, everyone else then followed suit. So, that's we don't have a historical record that any of these people really existed. We do know there were pharaohs. We know about building the cities and all of that, but it is an interesting point you're bringing up. Where was the community organization among the Hebrew slaves? I mean, maybe they just were kept, so busy and so oppressed that, like, no one else had come along, apparently.
No, that's not Jews. That's not Israelites. There was somebody that was a leader that stepped up.
Not important for our story.
Thanks, Pearl.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Aaron, as many times as I've read this, I did not notice until this time that Aaron is not mentioned at all in the in the chapter that describes Moshe's birth. There's a sister, but there's no brother. He's not mentioned at all. He doesn't come in until quite a few chapters later, which is, and he's going to play a huge role. Folks, it's almost 5:10. I'm willing to keep going, but, some of you probably are going to shul, so, feel free to leave. And thank you for your self-control. I'm glad we had some time for discussion. Eileen, could you send me what's in the chat? Is that possible?